Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. This is lesson 6 in psychology, and this week we're going to be talking about adulthood and old age. This is going to be the last of our discussions of the stages of humankind as we progress from the baby to death. This is the last two stages of life, and that is adulthood and old age. So we'll be looking at that during this presentation. Before we do begin, though, I wanted to spend a little time spotlighting, as we have in the past, a specific disease dealing with psychology. This week it's a physical ailment, but also certainly is a psychological ailment, and that is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's, most of you have probably heard of this disease. Some of you have probably had loved ones, grandparents potentially, that have suffered from this particular disease, and it's becoming more and more prevalent in the United States as baby boomers, those that were born after World War II, reach advanced age. And with the additional medical care that we have in this country, now we're starting to see certain diseases that are more cognitive, and Alzheimer's is certainly one of those. So what is Alzheimer's? Well, Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia. Dementia is essentially the loss of memory and your general cognitive functions, the ability to remember things, the ability to act upon things, the ability to recognize people. All of those are considered to be part of dementia, and Alzheimer's is a very common type, the most common type of dementia that people suffer. Unfortunately, Alzheimer's worsens over time, and at present there's no cure for Alzheimer's. There are ways that we're finding every day to lengthen the lifespan of people that suffer from Alzheimer's and potentially shorten the period of time where they're very, very debilitated, but at this point there is no cure. And generally, Alzheimer's patients live about 10 years after the initial onset of the disease. So once, it's usually loved ones that recognize some slippage in terms of memory with people, about 10 years after that point is where the disease has gone so far that it now is developing, is limiting the physical functions. And of course, Alzheimer's is very important in this country because it takes a huge toll on caregivers. No longer is the person with Alzheimer's able to care for themselves, remember what they need to do, function in daily life, and so they have to have care, either outside care, which of course can be very, very costly, or care by family, and that takes a huge toll usually on the children. So Alzheimer's is a very, very important disease in the United States, and one we're seeing more and more of. Okay, so before we get on with discussing what adulthood and old age is, let's define those. So adulthood we're going to define as the period between adolescence and old age. And typically this is somewhere about 18 to 64 years old. But remember, like anything else, there's no magic switch that turns on. Oh, now I'm an adult. Legally there are. You can vote at 18. You can go to big boy jail and big girl jail at 18. You can fight at 18 in the Army. But there's certainly nothing that says, I'm an adult now, I'm not an adult now in terms of our cognitive and our social functions. But that's how we would define it technically. Some of the typical events that we see for adults are marriage. About 90% of people in the United States at some point or another in their lives will be married. Development of a family, having children and rearing those children, raising those children up. Development of a career, so moving from a job into a stable career that can provide for that family. Increasing responsibility we certainly see in adulthood. No longer are the parents the general caregivers of the child. Now you're an adult and you take care of yourself and you're responsible for other people. And then towards the end of adulthood, we often see people that are caring for their own parents, like we talked about with Alzheimer's just a second ago, and that becomes a typical event in a lot of adults' lives. How about old age? Old age, again, just like we said before, period between adulthood and death, which is usually about 65 years old and up. Americans are living longer than ever before. We now live well into the 80s as an average. There's many, many people that are in their 90s and 100s in this country, and so as we're expanding our ability to care for people in terms of their medical health, we are extending those lives, and with that are a lot of social issues. How do we deal? How do we help people that are in advanced age, and what do they do to find value for their lives? What are some typical events in old age? Retirement is one of the most positive things that tends to happen. If you're lucky enough to have had a retirement savings, you can stop working and rely on your retirement. Go see the world, do whatever you want to do. Usually a decrease in physical ability. Things start to kind of slow down and shut down. Again, this is as time frame changes, and there's very, very active people well into their 60s, 70s, and 80s, but we tend to see a decrease in physical ability. Unfortunately, the loss of friends and potentially a spouse can happen during this time frame. We see a lot of elderly people that are attending lots of funerals of their friends and their loved ones. And oftentimes we also see the need for external care. They're no longer able to care for themselves or care for their spouse, and they may need some support, either in some sort of a care center or by their children or loved ones that are younger than them. What are some physical and cognitive changes that we tend to see, especially in adults? Well, the health in adults and elderly is in general based on their lifestyle choices. And this is where what you do in your young years starts to pay off or starts to bring you down. So if you made choices to smoke, to drink, to treat your body poorly, to become obese, all those things, those health effects tend to start to kick in pretty heavily in your later adulthood and your elderly years. If you tended to be in shape, watched what you eat, limit your alcohol and tobacco intake, generally your health tends to be better. With women during this time frame, we see menopause. That's the end of the monthly period, the ability to become pregnant and moving into a different phase of life. For men generally, but women too, we see something called the midlife crisis, and this is often made fun of, but it's an actual psychological time frame where people are starting to question who they are, what they've attained, what they've gained, and look for value in other things. The joke is usually, as it is with the cartoon in here, how do you deal with a midlife crisis? Well, you go out and you buy a Porsche, or you buy a Mustang, or you do something that makes you, feel younger again. But this is certainly something that's weighing on people's minds as they get into their late 40s usually and think about, what have I done with my life and how much time do I still have to go? We find that the peak of creativity is in the 40s in terms of most people. So obviously the creativity changes with each individual person, but that's a kind of an average. And we often see too, for parents, something called the empty nest syndrome, and that's in their late adulthood when their children are grown and leave to start their own lives. They have an empty nest, and so we have to reassign and refigure out what it is that we're doing as a couple, as a family unit, now that those children are no longer there. And sometimes that can be very, very exciting for couples. Sometimes that can actually be debilitating and lead to divorce as well. Social and personality development. We see oftentimes that the personality and the character that you have as an adolescent, the age that you are right now, pretty much stays the same through old age. So the things that you like to do, your personality, whether you're outgoing, whether you're shy, those tend to hold all the way through. Not 100%, but generally those kind of character traits that you see in teenagers and adolescents will carry all the way through. Social life, especially for adults, is often associated with your family. So the people that you're hanging out with, the folks that you know, the other adults may be associated with things that you're doing with your family, either your church, could be sports, activities that are happening with your kids, those type of things. Adults tend to be, and elderly folks tend to be more middle of the road on issues than they have in the past. Generally in the teenage years and the early 20s, there's a lot of people that are very, very certain about things, and those tend to erode a little bit as we get a little older and have a little more life experience. And we tend to generally be more tolerant of others and recognizing there are a lot of people with a lot of different life paths, and that tends to lead to a little more tolerance. Let's talk a little bit about aging, attitudes towards aging. And certainly we recognize that old age is as much kind of a state of mind as it is a particular number. We've defined old age as 65, but just like with adulthood, there's no magic switch. You're as old as you feel is one of the statements that a lot of people have. And so there's people that are doing very, very active, very, very, in quotes, young things well into their 60s and 70s. And I love this picture here of a grandma hanging out on the Harley. It's pretty cool. And so we see some people that act younger than their age might be, and we see some people that act older than their age might be. It really just kind of depends on a number of factors. However, when you get older, you do tend to be more susceptible to certain diseases. And the most common diseases that strike the elderly are heart disease, hypertension or high blood pressure, diabetes, and arthritis. And also, as people get older, depression can become a real issue. So, back to psychology, the idea of what depression is huge. There's clinical depression that really affects people. And as we get older, we find our physical and mental capacities starting to slip. That can lead to a lot of depression in older people. Death and dying. Death and dying is an amazingly complex concept, mental capacity that we think about as a society. And death is surrounded by customs that are very different in each society. And it can be a real taboo, and a taboo is something we just don't talk about. Death tends to be something that's very prickly. People don't like to talk about it, don't like to think about it, don't like to address it. Because obviously it is couched in a number of very, very negative things. But it's absolutely a part of life. We will all experience it at some point, and so thinking about it is important. We've recognized about 5 stages of adjustment to the concept of death. And this is generally people that are terminally ill, going through these stages, thinking about and contemplating their own death. The first step is denial. So when we first hear about it, we don't want to believe it. And that can't be true. It's wrong. The doctor's wrong. That's bad information. Once the denial stage is passed by, we go into anger, frustration. How can this possibly be happening to me? It's not fair. The next stage is bargaining. And usually that's bargaining with a higher power. So asking God or whoever the deity may be that's important to you to spare you or add years to your life if you do certain things. After that, it's depression. The inability to function because of the oncoming death. And finally, after that, and we hope most people get to this, is an acceptance, a recognition that death is natural, death is a part of life, and we all have to go through it, and accepting the fact that it's coming in your case. How we care for our terminally ill has changed a lot in this country, and what we do and the choices that people can make once they've been diagnosed as terminally ill are very different. And so most people now, or many people anyway, are choosing to die with limited medical intervention. And that means once they recognize that they are ill, they don't want to go through a huge number of medical interventions to try to spare their life, to try to prolong their life. They want to try to let kind of death come in a natural way. And a lot of people will have something called a do not resuscitate order, where if they slip into a particular state where they're moving towards death medically, that the doctor will not resuscitate, will not go to any kind of great actions to medically prolong their life. There's also a concept called death with dignity, and death with dignity is the idea that people would be able to pass away of their own choosing, and oftentimes that happens in the home, and oftentimes it happens with something called hospice care. Hospice is a fairly recent concept in the United States, but it certainly has been happening in the world for thousands of years. And that's the concept that people are made as comfortable as possible in their last days. That could happen in an actual care center, a hospice care center that's much more comfortable than a hospital would be. Or it could happen in the patient's home, where they're surrounded by things that are very familiar to them and hopefully their loved ones as they move towards death. A very, very charged political concept and social concept is the idea of euthanasia or assisted suicide. And this has been something that a number of different states have even brought up, and the state of Oregon has actually passed a law that says that people can end their own life if they're found to be terminally ill. A lot of people have very different ideas. Religion comes into play, philosophy comes into play about whether or not we should be allowing people to end their life if they're found to be terminally ill. Many people would agree that or believe that it is the right thing to do, that a person should have the right to choose how to end their life, especially if they're looking forward towards some sort of a horrible suffering. Others say no, it's not appropriate for people to end their own life before their time. And so those are social issues that we're dealing with, and we will actually deal with as part of our case study for this particular lesson. So that's some information about adulthood and old age. We will be continuing the discussion as we go through the chapter and the lesson this week. So take care of that, and we'll talk to you soon.